What's going on, everyone? This is Tyrone May here, Himalaya ride enthusiast and entrepreneur. Just arrived here at the Delaware State Fair. I'm back once again bringing you Chapter 7 from my book, The Himalaya, where the show flashes and the mirror ball spins. Basically, my book's about my story of how my fascination with the Himalaya ride started, which leads me to my journey to one day calling one of those classic rides of my very own. So if you'd like to purchase a copy, you can get it on Amazon or my online store. We can get some Himalaya fan-based merch, as you see here. Web address is shown below the screen. So without further ado, and before I get my day started, I'm going to bring you Chapter 7 from my book, titled New Year, New Decade, New Beginnings. It was the year 1990, which presented a brand new decade, and I was ready for some new experiences. But unfortunately, that year hadn't started on a bright note. During the early spring, my mother decided to do a little spring cleaning while I was in school one day. As soon as I came home, I went into my room to get my turntable so I could work on a better designed Himalaya model, but as I looked under my bed, a turntable was no longer there. I looked all over the place, but the turntable was not to be found, which I thought was strange. Later that day, I was playing in the backyard and saw that our trash can was so full that the lid couldn't shut all the way. As I looked closely, I happened to see my turntable in the trash can. I asked my mother why she put my turntable in the garbage can, and she told me she was throwing out everybody's old things, including some things of her own, and told me not to take anything out of the garbage can. I became furious, because I knew building a model of the Himalaya had always filled my time during the spring and summer seasons, and helped me get through the long, depressing fall and winter seasons. And now I knew I wouldn't be building another Himalaya model, at least for a while. A month later, school finally ended for the summer, and as usual, I started talking about going back to the fair in Ocean City for another fun-filled season. My father had some vacation time from the Air Force and made plans for us for a whole week, starting with a day in Ocean City, Maryland. Days before, my mother took me shopping for some new clothes, along with a fresh new pair of British Knight sneakers, so I could look nice for my week away with my father. Earlier that day, I packed my suitcase as I waited for him to arrive to pick me up from home to start our week together. Before we left, my mother told me to bring her some souvenirs from Ocean City and to give her a call when I had a chance. We left the house minutes later to get some refreshments at a convenience store and rented ourselves a room. Now the road my father had taken wasn't the familiar road I was used to, which I know now is Route 1, which normally took about 3 to 4 hours to get to the resort town. This was the day I would be introduced to another road to the resort town, which is Route 113. This road had taken us down the Milford Highway, and to my surprise, this new route made the trip a lot shorter than I expected. During the ride at Ocean City, I was constantly telling them about always wanting to ride the Himalaya at nighttime so I could see all the lighting it had. My father told me that was no problem at all. We arrived in Ocean City in late afternoon, and I was ready to start the day. As soon as we got out of the car, he got out his brand new VHS camcorder, one of those big bulky video cameras you had to carry over your shoulder. We started to make our way to my favorite amusement park, Tremper's Rides, located at the end of the boardwalk. As we went to the Himalaya, I told my father that this time I wanted to wait till nighttime to ride it because I had never ridden it at night before. He told me I should still ride it now, then we'll go back as soon as the sun goes down. Before I went on the ride, I requested that my father took some shots of the artwork and the mirror ball with his camcorder. My father smiled and said, "Okay," as I ran up those large pink stairs on the ride. One of the workers greeted me and showed me to my own seat. As I sat in my seat waiting for the ride to start, my father turned on his camcorder and started recording. Suddenly the ride started going slowly backwards, as usual. But when the ride sped up, the strobe light suddenly came on. Even though it was still daylight, I was stoked because at least the light was working, and when nighttime came around, I'd be able to see it working at its finest. The ride suddenly slowed down and started going forward. After the ride was over, I got out of my seat and went to my father, who was still recording, and exclaimed, "That was fun!" After my first ride on the Himalaya, we left the park for a while and started walking down the boardwalk so I could save my tickets for later that evening. As we cruised the boardwalk, we saw the world's biggest sandcastles. Every year, Ocean City had a sand sculpture contest where we see some of the most creative and the most impossible looking sand sculptures you will ever see. I'm talking about a castle that was surrounded by a huge dragon, all made of just sand and water, which I thought was truly amazing. Afterwards, we walked some more and saw some boardwalk performers and some huge beach kites flying in the air. We've done so much sightseeing that day. The sun finally started to go down as nighttime approached, which meant it was time to go back to the park so I could see the Himalaya all lit up, and I'll be riding it at night for the first time in my life. When we returned to the park, the Himalaya was packed full of people, getting on and off the ride. I got my tickets ready and started heading up the stairs while my father turned on his camcorder. As I listened to the latest music blasting from the ride sound system, I looked at all the lights this Himalaya had. This particular ride had 2 white spotlights shining on the tunnel, which were used as boarding lights instead of the string of white lights I normally saw on the Himalaya at the Delaware State Fair. Suddenly, the bright lights went off and the ride slowly began. The ride operator turned on the mic and says, Please keep your arms and legs inside your feet on the floor below that your line." After a couple of laps, the ride sped up a little. As soon as it reached its full speed, the strobe light flashed in the tunnel, along with 2 white spotlights shining on the big mirror ball. What a beautiful sight it was as everything became a spinning blur. Women goes around and around, going faster and faster by the minute. Suddenly, the operator yelled on the microphone, "Do you want to go faster?" "Yeah," the crowd responded as the Himalaya continued to whip us around at super speed. The ride started to slow down, and the operator said on the microphone, "We're going to slow you down and take you faster the other way." As the ride started going forward, the operator continued to talk on the microphone, saying, "It's time to put the Himalaya on squeeze mode." We all knew what that meant. Suddenly, the ride started going faster and faster, and the crowd started screaming and wooing as loud as they could. The operator yelled over the microphone, "I can't hear you." That's when the crowd screamed even louder than before, so loud it nearly hurt my ears. As we rolled around extremely fast, the operator said on the microphone, "Get your tickets ready for the next real fast ride on the Himalaya." The ride started slowing down, and the operator announced, "Guess what? We're going to do it all over again one more time." The ride sped up once again while the strobe light flashed and the rider screamed with delight. At the end of the ride, the operator says, "That's right, everybody, this is the Himalaya. Remain seated as the ride comes to a complete stop and exit to the front of the ride, please." As we all left the ride, a new load of riders started boarding. I'll never forget that moment. My first experience riding the Himalaya in Ocean City at night, which was another huge milestone for me at the time. Funny thing though, I've seen about every light this ride had, including those flashing multicolored snowflake decorations on top of the ride's tunnel, but I hadn't seen the 2 color wheel lights work that whole evening. I guess they just weren't working that night. Nonetheless, riding that Himalaya at nighttime for the first time was something I would never forget, and now I'll have a video so I can relive that moment over and over again. After my final ride on the Himalaya, we left Ocean City and stopped for some dinner before heading back to the motel. As we returned to the motel, my father hooked up the camcorder to the television so I could watch the video of my experience on the Himalaya. As I watched that video for the first 4 times, I knew right then and there that I really wanted a Himalaya ride of my very own, and that video made my passion grow more and more. The next day, we left the motel. We started heading to the other side of Maryland, where my father was staying at a studio apartment on Fort Meade. We stayed for a few days. My father and I pretty much went everywhere between Maryland and Delaware on those days we were together. Until one night I started to get a little homesick towards the end of our week. So we decided to cut our time short and pick up where we left off in a few days. That day finally came about a week later, which brought us back for another trip to Ocean City. But this time we had company. Lots and lots of company. A lot of our relatives, old and young, decided to come with us that day, along with my 3 cousins, Lorena, Toya, and Cindy, who always hung together. After my father picked me up, we started heading to Milford, where my uncle had a large van we all piled into. We started making our way down Route 113 towards the resort town after a few pit stops. During the ride, I was telling everyone about my first time riding the Himalaya at night. One of my younger cousins, Chris, told me he wanted to ride the Himalaya with me. I told him I didn't know if that would be a good idea because I like riding by myself, but he was dead set on riding with me, and I knew he wouldn't take no for an answer. And besides, he always loved to hang around me, so I couldn't help but cave in and told him that he could ride the Himalaya with me, which really made his day. We all talked about various things and had some good laughs until we finally reached Ocean City, Maryland. As we reached the inlet, I pointed out Tremper's amusement park, which nobody could miss because the first thing you'll see is the big white roller coaster. We got closer and I pointed out the Himalaya ride to everyone. After we found a good parking spot, we all got out the vehicle and started heading to Trippers. A few of us went over to the ticket booth to purchase a sheet of tickets. I made my way over to the Himalaya, my cousin Chris tagging along. This would be his first time on the Himalaya ride, so I was a little nervous for him. As we got to our seats, I was showing him around on the ride while my father recorded. Loud rock music blasted from the ride sound system as we waited for the other riders to hop on. Minutes later, the ride started. The ride began to speed up, and the operator said on the microphone, "Here we go faster." I glanced over at Chris, and he looked like he was having more fun than I was. He started to remind me of myself during my first time on the Himalaya at the State Fair of 1985. When the ride stopped and we started going forward, he squashed me like a grape, but we both had a ball. When it was time to get off the ride, Chris grabbed me by the shoulder and shouted out, "We have to do this again." I told him we would ride it again at night so we could see all of its flashing lights. Chris couldn't wait until we rode it again, and neither could I. After the Himalaya, I went on the yo-yo swings while Chris, TJ, and some of my other younger cousins went on some of the kiddie rides. Some of my older relatives went their own separate ways until it was time for all of us to meet back at the vehicle. I swung high in the air on those revolving swings. I glanced at the Himalaya on almost every lap until the ride was over. During the day, we also visited another amusement park that was located at the pier where my three older cousins were. This park was usually known for their giant Ferris wheel. Minutes later, we were approached by all three of my cousins. They started talking to me about a ride called the Hurricane, which was their version of the Himalaya, but a little more flashy. The artwork on this ride was airbrushed, and it featured some beach property being destroyed by a big storm. Up on the ride's roof structure were two spinning disco lights that were hanging on each side of the ride. The ride's centerpiece was something that looked like some kind of spinning top with lights all around it. The ride's design and lighting looked great, and their artwork looked amazing. Toy, who had just finished riding along with Lorena and Cindy, asked me if I wanted to try it out, but I turned it down because I just couldn't stop thinking about the Himalaya. Though I would love to try out this other ride, my loyalty to the Himalaya just wouldn't let me that day. We all left the pier moments later and went back to the boardwalk to look at the giant sand castles, which were partially damaged by the treacherous rain from a couple of days before. But after the sun went down, we all went back to Trippers so Chris and I could make our return back to the Himalaya. Chris and I got our tickets ready and bum rushed up those pink stairs, where the worker waited for our tickets. He showed us to our seats. Chris was excited to ride with me again. I looked around at the artwork and the lights while more people boarded the ride. We were actually sitting close to the operator/DJ booth where we spotted those little battery-operated dancing cola bottles that were grooving to the music. After all the cars were filled, the White House lights went off, and the mirror ball began to glow from the two white spotlights as the ride slowly began. The Himalaya started going faster and faster, and the crowd screamed while the operator performed his act over the microphone. Going forward on the ride was when the crowd became even more lively and excited. They sang along with the song that was playing, and the loud reactions they gave as the ride went up to its fullest speed, with the strobe light flashing brightly and the mirror ball reflecting all over the ride with all of its pride and glory was magic, just pure magic. Chris and I riding the Himalaya, on that day, it became a bonding experience between us, which today changed us from being just cousins to being best friends. As soon as the ride ended, we all got together and started making our way back to the van and left the resort town. We grabbed some dinner at a nearby McDonald's before heading all the way back to Milford to take some of our relatives home. Chris told me how much fun he had with me riding the Himalaya and was happy that he had such a great experience with me on that night. And what a great night it was. My father and I left Milford minutes later to take me back home to Dover, where I immediately went straight to bed and dreamt about my favorite ride. Another week came, and after my days in Ocean City, I was determined to create a newer and better Himalaya model, even though I didn't have my turntable anymore. This time things became a little more interesting. I used my color wheel light, which I had once used for one of my earlier models, but this time I was using it to substitute for my turntable and build a new model around it. I drew out my new scenery and tried for the second time to copy the artwork of the Himalaya at the park in Ocean City. I positioned the color wheel light in a way that the actual wheel could spin horizontally with a slight diagonal. I made some new cutout cars and placed them on the actual spinning wheel. The wheel normally spins very slowly, so I had to spin it with my hand to make it go faster. This one was basically a slightly advanced version of the very first model I had made before I even started using the turntable. Since I didn't have my turntable anymore, I had to make do with what I had and worked with it until I had a chance to someday receive another turntable. Later one Saturday, my father picked me up and I went with him for the day, as I normally do every weekend. Later that evening, he had a little present for me, which happened to be my very own copy of the video of me riding the Himalaya in Ocean City. I was ecstatic because I had my own copy and I could watch videos of the ride anytime I wished. As soon as my father took me home that evening, I immediately popped in that tape and watched it for hours on end. It was finally July again, which was the month the fair arrived. Days before, I actually had a sneak peek of the fair for the very first time. I went with Aunt Anna and cousins Shanita and Kelly to a baseball game outside of Harrington, which took us on the same road that leads us to the fairgrounds parking lot. I looked to my left and saw the back of the Himalaya, which happened to have a new blue and white top canvas instead of the yellowish color it normally had. "There's the Himalaya," I happily yelled. My cousin Kelly responded, "Oh, jeez, here he goes," as I laughed at her. When we arrived at the baseball game, they all went to the bleachers, and I found some other kids started playing with them. I constantly ranted and raved about the Himalaya and its new top canvas. The other kids were as excited as I was about the fair. Even though it was only a couple of days away, I didn't know how I could wait any longer. Then days went by seemingly in slow motion, and the fair finally opened on that Thursday night. My mother, my cousin Kelly, who had actually stayed with us for a few days, and I left the house around 8:30 p.m. as we normally do every year. As soon as we arrived in Harrington, the first thing I saw was the bright green yellow glow of the Sky Wheel, the Super Loop, and the Giant Wheel, along with the rest of the big rides as we got closer to the fairgrounds. When we arrived at the parking lot, we parked, and I immediately jumped out of the car and see and hear the Himalaya as it sat in its usual spot. I saw its new top canvas, which I thought looked better than the yellowish color it had before. As we walked closer to the back of the ride, I heard the music, the siren, and the usual ride operator / DJ talking his junk over the microphone. I went to the front of the ride and noticed that the tunnel was back in its place, along with the strobe light that was usually attached to the back of it. The main scenery artwork stayed the same, but the ride had 2 new spotlights for the mirror ball. The strobe light flashed as the ride sped up. It usually flashed over the cars as they whizzed by, but this time it flashed on the scenery behind the cars for some reason. I watched the ride do its magic, and I couldn't believe what I saw next. The ride operator was actually wearing an all-black cowboy outfit with rhinestones and wearing sunglasses. This guy had the boots, the hat, the whole package. I thought to myself, it was such an unusual sight, but regardless, I thought he was just way too cool, especially when he talked on the microphone just like every year. After my first gaze at the Himalaya, we started walking down the midway to see what other rides the fair had that year. I started with my usual first ride, the Wave Swinger, just to get my adrenaline going. As soon as the ride took me into the air, I looked over to the Himalaya. I couldn't wait to ride it, especially after what happened to me during the previous year when I was forced to ride with a complete stranger and then wasn't able to ride it during the following visit due to an extremely long line. After a couple of other rides, I was ready to ride the Himalaya, so we went back over to the ride, and to my surprise, the Himalaya was temporarily closed for some strange reason. I was shocked and became very upset because I felt like my whole night was ruined once again, because something like that just wasn't normal. We walked back down the midway, and all I could think about was my favorite ride being closed down. They could have closed any other ride at the whole entire fair. Why the Himalaya of all things? To this day, I still can't understand what happened. I decided to wait after it ran the first few times before I went on, just for safety's sake. While I was waiting, I had to find someone to ride the Himalaya with me because Kelly didn't feel like riding, and I didn't want the same thing happening to me like that previous year. I went to everybody I knew, one after another, but nobody wanted to ride the Himalaya with me. I became so frustrated, I stopped where I was and I yelled, "I am not leaving this fair tonight until I find someone to ride the Himalaya with me." A friend of Kelly's was on her way to the ride, so I ended up riding with her that evening. I didn't know who this person was, but as long as I was on the Himalaya, I didn't care who rode with me. Unlike that previous year, I started to become mentally prepared in case I had to ride with a total stranger. We gave our tickets to the worker and went to our seats and waited for the ride to start. I sat back and listened to the bass-filled music and watched the operator make the string of white lights flash off and on to the beat of the music, while I found myself once again fantasizing about owning my very own Himalaya ride someday. Finally, the white lights went out and the ride began going forward, going faster by the minute. After a couple of laps, the ride sped up even more, almost all the way. Seconds later, the operator asked that oh-so-famous question, "Hey, do you want to go faster?" Everybody shouted, "Yeah," and I was thinking, it now goes faster than this? We were already going at a pretty good speed. Now the operator sped up a little bit more as he did his routine, along with the strobe light and siren going. We were going so fast, I actually felt like I was bouncing up and down in my seat. This particular Himalaya seemed to go just a little bit faster than last year, and it was so much fun. For some reason, rides, especially Himalaya, always seem to go a lot faster at nighttime. The ride finally stopped and we hopped out of the car. I was now ready to go home because my night had become complete. We made some last minute stops to stock up on some cotton candy, apples, and peanuts before we left the fairgrounds. As we walked down the path on the way to the car, I looked back at the Himalaya and smiled because I knew I could go home happy. Saturday of that same week, my father picked me up from home and I spent the whole day with him and ended the evening with another great night at the fair. I had the feeling that this evening was going to be better than that previous year's experiences. We showed up at the fair later that evening, and I constantly thought about the Himalaya all throughout the day. I went on a couple of rides by myself, but there were certain ones my father went on with me. There was this new ride called the Super Sizzler, which was the same as the Scrambler, but it spins in a slight angle and it was 10 times faster, with music and a painted backdrop along with a hidden fog machine under the platform of the ride. We got on the ride, but I didn't really expect anything. That was until the ride started to pick up speed. I realized that I was sitting on the wrong side of the seat, meaning I was going to get squeezed by my father when the ride started going a lot faster. But nonetheless, that ride was fun. Painful, but fun. However, I got my revenge when it was time to ride the Himalaya. As we waited for the ride to start, I looked over at the center mirror ball and I noticed some wheels underneath, which finally gave me a clue of how the ball spun in the opposite direction. The ride began and I had a chance to do all the squeezing. We rode it twice that evening, which was a first for me because I've always saved the Himalaya for last, my personal grand finale of my evening. After that, the evening came to an end and we left the fair. I happily looked back at the Himalaya thinking about the next time I would return to the fair. On the following Thursday, which was an armband day, my mother made plans to take me back to the fair later that evening. Earlier that day, my mother and I went over to the mall, where one of the department stores was having a tent sale. The radio station we were listening to on the way there sometimes plays songs from the past, which they call Flashback Jam of the Day. This certain song that they happened to play on that day was Firecracker by Mass Production. I never heard that song before until that very day, but I absolutely loved it from the start. My mother then began telling me she remembered hearing the song when she was at the fair with Aunt Christine and my grandmother on a hot July evening in 1979. She told me that this very song was playing on the Himalaya that night when they were riding. That story, she told me, made me like the song even more, and to this day, every time I hear that song playing, I can't help but think about the Himalaya and the story my mother told me. Later that evening, we went to pick up Aunt Christine and headed to the fairgrounds. After spinning around on my first few choices of rides, and this time sitting on the safe side of the Super Sizzler ride, squishing my aunt, it was that special time of the night when I ride the Himalaya. As we got near the ride, I heard a strange but memorable request from the ride operator. While doing his usual act on the microphone while the ride was around at its highest speed, he said on the microphone, "On the count of 3, I want everybody to wish the Himalaya a happy birthday." The Himalaya actually has a birthday? I asked myself loudly. The operator started counting. "Everybody ready? 1, 2, 3. The crowd loudly screamed, "Happy birthday!" The operator said on the microphone, "The Himalaya says thank you. This ride turned 11 years old today." After he said that, my face lit up brighter than before because I was also 11 years old, even though my birthday had been 2 months before. But the fact that this Himalaya actually had a birthday and we were both the same age really made this ride even more special to me. Aunt Christine and I got our tickets and went to the end of the line. As we waited for our turn to climb aboard this wonderful ride, the whole Himalayas birthday thing made me more amped up than ever. Not only to ride it, but to have one of my very own someday. The line got shorter and it was finally time for us to ride. We gave our tickets and headed to our seats and waited for the ride to start. As the ride filled up, the show began. The bright lights went off and we started moving. The spotlights dazzled the mirror ball. It created its famous blizzard effect on the painted winter-themed artwork. The loud music blared from the sound system with so much bass that it felt like someone was pounding on my chest. The Himalaya went faster, the siren wailed, and the strobe light flashed as the operator yodeled loudly over the microphone. "Are you getting squished?" asked my aunt. She answered, "What do you think?" The ride started slowing down slightly, and just like that, it started speeding up once more, with the strobe light and siren going, until it slowed down for the last time, and it was finally time to depart the ride. After we left the Himalaya, we got some last-minute refreshments and left the fairgrounds. I took my last glimpse of the Himalaya and sighed happily, even though it was going to be my last time seeing the ride because it was towards the end of the fair. Every once in a while, my mother spends a couple of bucks to play the lottery. She asked me, "If we ever win the lottery, what do you want to buy with some of the money?" I answered, "I want to someday buy my own Himalaya ride." "Are you crazy?" she responded. She added, "If you get this Himalaya, where the hell would you put it?" I answered, "In the backyard." "Honey, you're going to buy yourself some land first if you're going to do all that." I replied, "Okay, if we win enough, I will do just that." Hey, I could have tried to save up again, but just like the last time, I would just end up giving in to the next hottest toy on the market and then kicking myself over and over again. And personally, I just couldn't bear the thought of going through that again. The next weekend, my father picked me up and I spent my Saturday with him. Later that day, I made a request. I asked him if he had his video camera, which he always carried with him. I told him that I wanted to make a little video of the Himalaya model, and I wanted to see what the model looked like in a home video. "Sure," my father answered. So later that evening, after a fun-filled day, my father took me home and came inside with his camcorder. As soon as he went inside, he followed me into the den where I kept my model. I gave him my videotape. As I started getting everything set up, I found myself looking for two of my flashlights I just bought days before to shine on the center mirror ball, but I couldn't remember where I put them. So instead, I used one of my other colored lights that I had in my room and aimed it at the model. He turned on his camcorder as I dimmed the lights and turned on the stereo. I started spinning the model with my hand gently for the illusion that it was starting out slow, just like the real thing. Seconds later, I started spinning the model a little faster. I reached over and turned on my strobe light, which was located at the top of the sofa, flashing down on the model. As soon as I was finished, my father gave me back my videotape, which I couldn't wait to watch and see how it came out. After he had gone, I turned on the VCR and watched my newest addition to my Himalaya home movies. As I watched my video on television for the first time, I didn't really like how it looked because I felt that it didn't really look as good as the real thing. I felt like if I at least had my flashlights on the mirror ball in the center, let alone using the actual turntable, maybe it would look halfway decent. I did find the flashlights eventually because they were under my bed the whole time. I felt like an idiot, but at least I found them and placed them on the back to the front of my model aimed at the center mirror ball, which made the model look pretty good. Even though this current model wasn't as good as the previous ones I had made when I had the turntable, I kept this one for a while, even though I was pretty much above the whole pushing method from the first model I made back in 1986. And there you have it. That was Chapter 7. Hope you enjoyed it so far. Please sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to buy my book, you can buy it on Amazon or my online store along with tons of fan-based merch. I'll be back on here next month with Chapter 8. So as we say in the Himalaya world, keep that mirror ball spinning. Take care.